welcome back to Conversations About Bookbinding, the podcast carefully curated by Edward Kranz.
The Honey Badger Binder.
That's right, the Honey Badger Binder of Bookforge.
And we are so excited to have you all back with us again.
It's fascinating to think that every book has its own unique story.
Absolutely.
Not just within its pages, but in its physical journey through time. And today we're diving deep into the world of preserving those stories with someone who knows them intimately.
Oh, yeah.
Our very own Edward.
That's right.
So, Edward.
It's true. Each book carries a history, a tangible record of its existence. And you've sent us a real treasure trove of material on book care.
Oh, wow.
Articles, videos, even some notes from Edward's presentation to the Erie County Public Library.
Right.
It seems like you're on a mission to become quite the book whisperer yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, who doesn't want to learn how to care for their books?
Yeah.
So consider this our crash course in becoming a guardian of your own literary treasures.
Absolutely. And to kick things off, let's clarify some terms Edward uses. Conservation, restoration, and preservation. These get thrown around a lot, but there are some key distinctions.
Right.
Think of it like approaching a patient, right? Sometimes you need a simple bandage. Sometimes surgery. And sometimes it's about creating a lifestyle that prevents problems in the first place.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So if conservation is like a little first aid, what does restoration look like?
Yeah.
Is that where Edward's Honey Badger persona really comes out?
Kinda. Restoration is more intensive, like reconstructive surgery. It's about bringing a book back to its original glory, often involving recreating missing elements or repairing significant damage.
Right.
Edward's presentation had a great example of this. Rebacking. Where a detached spine needs a whole new lease on life.
So rebacking, it sounds kind of intense. What exactly does that entail?
Well, imagine a book's spine as its backbone, right? When it's detached, the book is essentially falling apart.
Right.
Rebacking involves carefully removing the old damaged spine and replacing it with a new one, ensuring it's securely attached to both the cover boards and the text block. It requires a deep understanding of the book's original construction and a steady hand.
Yeah. That makes sense. So it's not just slapping on a new spine.
Right.
It's like rebuilding a crucial support structure.
Exactly. And this is where Edward's expertise really shines.
Yeah.
He's like a book detective.
Oh, wow.
Carefully analyzing the book's structure and using his knowledge of historical binding techniques to ensure a proper and lasting repair.
That's awesome. So speaking of repairs, you mentioned first aid for books earlier. What are some common book ailments that might need that kind of attention?
Well, think about the things that happen in everyday life, spills, accidents, even just the wear and tear of time. Water damage is a classic example. A book gets left out in the rain or takes an unexpected dip in the bathtub.
Oh no, could a soggy book be saved?
Don't worry, there's hope.
Okay, good.
Edward emphasized that speed is key here.
Right.
You want to act fast to blot up excess moisture. Using absorbent materials like blotting paper or thin cloths. He even recommends having a special emergency kit for just such an occasion. Stocked with blotting paper cloths and those little silica gel packets you find in shoeboxes.
So it's all about damage control. Get that moisture out. ASAP. But what about drying the book? Is it okay to use a hairdryer, or is that a recipe for disaster?
You know, it's funny you should ask that. Edward actually cautioned against using heat to dry books.
Really?
He compared it to cooking the book rather than drying it.
Oh, no.
Saying it can damage the adhesives and the paper itself. Instead, he recommends air drying, ideally with the book open and supported to prevent warping.
Makes sense. So slow and steady wins the race when it comes to drying a book.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about another book lover's nightmare mold. I shudder just thinking about it.
It's definitely not pretty.
Yeah.
And Edward was pretty upfront about the potential hazards of mold, especially for those with allergies or respiratory issues.
Yeah.
He even said there are some cases where it's just best to let a book go.
That's heartbreaking. But I guess sometimes it's necessary. What about those books that are salvageable? How do you tackle mold safely?
Edward likened it to a crime scene cleanup.
Oh, wow.
You want to suit up with gloves and a mask, work in a well-ventilated area, and isolate the affected books to prevent the mold from spreading.
Sounds intense.
Yeah.
What about actually cleaning the mold? Any secret weapons?
Edward recommends carefully cleaning the affected areas with alcohol wipes,
Okay.
emphasizing that you need to discard them properly to avoid spreading spores.
Right.
And for odor removal, he swears by a product called Smellies.
Smellies, that's a catchy name. So we've covered water damage and mold. What are some other common book emergencies?
Well, one that comes up a lot is detached pages or loose sections within a book.
Right.
It can happen with age, rough handling, or even just a manufacturing flaw.
So what's the game plan when you find a loose page fluttering around in your book?
Yeah.
Is it a DIY situation or time to call the book doctor?
Edward says it depends on the extent of the damage and the value of the book. If it's just a few pages, you can often reattach them with archival quality adhesive.
Right.
But if it's a valuable book or a complex repair,
Okay.
it's best to consult a professional.
That makes sense. It's like with any kind of repair, know your limits and when to call in the experts.
Right.
And speaking of experts, Edward seems to have a real knack for knowing when to refer a patient, so to speak.
Absolutely. He's very upfront about the fact that he's not a miracle worker.
Right.
If a book needs a specialist, he'll happily point them in the right direction.
Yeah.
It shows real integrity and a genuine desire to see the book get the best possible care.
And that's a great segue into our next topic, rare book restoration. This is where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
And full resuscitation for antique treasures.
Absolutely.
But before we dive into that, we'll be back in a flash to explore the world of bringing literary history back to life. See you in a sec.
Sounds good. Welcome back to Conversations About Bookbinding.
I'm so glad to be back.
Before we went on break, we were talking about Edward's willingness to refer clients to specialists when needed.
Right.
A true mark of a dedicated book guardian.
Absolutely.
And now, as promised, we're diving into the fascinating world of rare book restoration.
I'm all ears. This is the stuff that really sparks my imagination.
Oh, yeah.
It's like stepping back in time and giving these literary relics a second chance to tell their stories.
Exactly. It's a combination of historical research, artistic skill, and scientific precision.
Wow.
Edward described it as piecing together a historical puzzle, sometimes quite literally.
So what are we talking about here? Books that are hundreds of years old?
Yeah.
What kind of shape are they typically in when they arrive at Edward's workshop?
It really varies.
Okay.
Some might have missing covers.
Right.
Others might be riddled with insect damage or crumbling from age.
Oh, no.
Edward talked about a 17th century midwifery book he worked on.
Wow.
That was stained with, well, let's just say it had a lot of lived experience embedded in its pages.
Wow, that's incredible. You can practically feel the history in those stains.
Yeah.
So how does Edward even begin to approach something like that?
It starts with careful examination,
Okay.
understanding the book's original construction, and identifying the materials used. Then it's about meticulously cleaning and stabilizing the existing pages.
Okay.
And recreating missing elements as accurately as possible.
You mentioned recreating elements.
Yeah.
Does that mean sometimes he has to make entirely new parts for these antique books?
Absolutely. In some cases, the original covers might be too far gone to salvage, or pages might be completely missing.
Oh, wow.
Then it becomes a bit like forensic science.
Okay.
Edward works closely with conservators to analyze paper types, inks, and binding methods to ensure the new elements are as close to the original as possible.
It sounds incredibly detailed and delicate.
It is.
What's an example of one of those forensic techniques?
One that Edward mentioned was watermarks.
Okay.
These faint designs embedded in the paper can reveal where and when the paper was made.
Wow.
By comparing the watermarks in the existing pages with historical records.
Okay.
They can track down paper that's a close match to the original.
Wow. It's amazing to think about the level of detail and research that goes into restoring these rare books.
Yeah.
It's like they're getting a whole new lease on life.
Absolutely.
But all this intricate work must come at a cost.
It does.
How does Edward even begin to put a price tag on something like that?
That's a great question, and it leads us to an important point that Edward emphasized. The value of a book goes far beyond its market price.
I can definitely see that, especially with these antique books.
Yeah.
They hold so much history and cultural significance.
Exactly. Edward shared a really touching anecdote about an AAA Bible he restored for a client.
Oh, wow.
The book was falling apart, and the repair costs were significant. But for the client, it was priceless.
Why was it a rare first edition or something?
It wasn't about rarity or monetary value. It was about personal history.
Okay.
The client had used that Bible throughout his 35 years of sobriety.
Wow.
It was filled with notes, inscriptions, highlighted passages,
Okay.
a tangible record of his journey.
Well, that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
The book became a symbol of his recovery,
Yeah.
a testament to his strength and resilience.
Right.
That kind of value goes way beyond dollars and cents.
Exactly. And Edward really underscored the importance of recognizing and respecting that sentimental value.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that books are more than just objects.
Right.
They're vessels of personal stories, memories, and emotions.
It makes you look at your own bookshelf a little differently, doesn't it?
It really does.
We've talked about the emotional value of books, but I'm curious about the financial side too.
Okay.
What are some factors that might make a book more desirable for collectors?
Well, one obvious one is author notoriety.
Yeah.
A signed first edition by a famous author can be worth a small fortune.
Right.
But there are other factors, too.
Like what? Give us the insider scope.
Things like limited edition runs,
Okay.
especially those with low print numbers, can make a book highly sought after.
Right.
And then there are factors like illustrations, unique bindings, or special features like deckled edges that can add to a book's value.
So it's like a treasure hunt.
Yeah.
You never know what hidden gems might be lurking on your bookshelf.
You really don't.
But let's be real. How do you actually figure out if a book is worth anything?
Right.
Is it all about checking eBay or Amazon?
Actually, Edward cautioned against relying solely on those platforms for accurate valuations.
Right.
He called them the Wild West of book pricing,
Okay.
where prices can fluctuate wildly
Right.
and authenticity is not always guaranteed.
So where do you go for reliable information? Is there some secret book appraiser society we need to know about?
Not quite a secret society,
Okay.
but Edward did recommend some reputable online resources
Oh.
like A-Books, Vilibri, and Bookbinder.
Right.
These sites aggregate data from booksellers worldwide, giving you a more realistic picture of what similar books are selling for.
Okay, so those are good starting points. But what if you want a more personalized assessment?
Right.
Is it worth getting a professional appraisal?
It can be, especially if you suspect a book might be particularly valuable or historically significant. And, Edward himself offers appraisal services.
Oh, cool.
He has that trained eye for spotting those subtle details that can make all the difference.
So we've talked about book emergencies, rare book resuscitation,
Yeah.
and even how to uncover hidden treasures on our own bookshelves.
A lot to think about.
It is, but it's all about protecting and preserving these little pieces of history, isn't it?
Absolutely. But preserving a book isn't just about fancy techniques or expensive restorations.
Right.
It's also about the everyday care we give to the books we love.
That makes sense.
And that brings us to Edward's next bit of advice.
Okay.
Building your own book sanctuary.
Now that's something I can get behind. I'm all for creating a cozy haven for my literary companions. Welcome back to Conversations About Bookbinding. We've been talking about giving our books the royal treatment, creating a little sanctuary where they can thrive.
Right.
So spill the secrets. What are Edward's top tips for keeping those pages happy and healthy?
Well, think of it this way. If books could talk,
Yeah.
what would they ask for?
Right.
A comfy spot, the right climate, and maybe a gentle dusting now and then.
Okay, I'm picturing a cozy reading nook with perfect lighting and a comfy armchair. But what about the bookshelves themselves?
Right.
Any specific recommendations there?
Edward is a big advocate for metal shelves. He says they're sturdier and less prone to harboring pests or mold than wood.
Okay.
Plus, they won't warp or sag over time under the weight of all those literary treasures.
That makes sense. Metal is definitely more durable, but what if you've already got wooden shelves?
Yeah.
Is it a lost cause?
Not necessarily. Edward suggests using a barrier between the books and the shelves, like acid-free paper or fabric to protect them from any potential damage.
All right.
And if you're buying new wooden shelves, he recommends opting for solid wood over particle board,
Okay.
which can off-gas harmful chemicals.
Good to know. So we've got the shelves sorted. What about the environment? Is there an ideal temperature and humidity for books?
It's funny you should ask that.
Yeah.
Edward actually compares books to Goldilocks.
Okay.
They like things just right.
Ah.
Extreme temperatures and humidity fluctuations can wreak havoc on paper and bindings.
Oh, no.
He recommends aiming for a cool, dry environment with good air circulation.
So no stashing your books in the attic or the basement.
No,
Got it.
probably not a good idea.
What about light? I know direct sunlight can fade book covers, but what about artificial light?
You're right. Direct sunlight is a big no-no. It can cause fading discoloration and even make the paper brittle over time.
Right.
And while artificial light isn't as intense, it's still best to avoid prolonged exposure.
Okay.
Edward recommends using blinds or curtains to filter light.
Right.
Especially for valuable or antique books.
Okay, so we've covered shelves, temperature, humidity, and light.
Hmm.
What about those everyday tasks like cleaning and dusting?
Yeah.
Any special techniques we should know about?
Edward is a big believer in gentle handling.
Yeah.
He recommends using a soft brush or a microfiber cloth to dust books.
Right.
Working from the top down and away from the spine to avoid pushing dust into the binding.
Right.
And he stresses that less is more when it comes to cleaning.
Okay.
No harsh chemicals or abrasive cleaners.
It's like giving your books a spa day.
Exactly.
So we've created our ideal book sanctuary. We're dusting gently, and we're handling our books with care. What are some other preventative measures we can take to ensure our literary companions stay in tip-top shape?
One thing Edward emphasized is proper shelving technique.
Okay.
He says overcrowding can cause warping and damage to spines.
Right.
He recommends leaving a little space between books to allow for air circulation and prevent them from rubbing against each other.
So no cramming those last few books onto an already packed shelf. Noted. What about those pesky little bookworms? Any tips for keeping those critters at bay?
Edward actually had some interesting insights on that. He says regular cleaning and dusting are the best defense against pests.
Right.
And he recommends checking your books periodically for any signs of insect activity.
Okay.
Especially in older books or those stored in less than ideal conditions.
Good advice. It's much easier to deal with a minor infestation than a full-blown bookworm invasion. So we've learned about creating a book-friendly environment, proper handling techniques, and even how to keep those pesky bugs away.
Right.
But what about those times when, despite our best efforts, a book needs a little more TLC?
That's where having a basic book repair kit comes in handy.
Right.
Edward recommends stocking up on a few essential supplies.
Right. Like what?
Acid-free tape for minor tears, archival quality glue for loose pages, a bone folder for creasing and smoothing, and a book press for flattening warped pages.
Sounds like a mini book hospital right in your own home.
It is.
But how do you know when a DIY repair is enough and when it's time to call in the professionals?
That's a great question. Edward emphasized that recognizing your limitations is key.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with a valuable book, extensive damage, or a repair that's beyond your comfort level, it's always best to consult a professional bookbinder or conservator.
Makes sense. It's better to be safe than sorry, especially when it comes to those irreplaceable literary treasures. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of book care, what's the biggest takeaway you think listeners should remember?
I think Edward summed it up perfectly when he said that preserving books is about more than just preserving objects.
Yeah.
It's about preserving the stories, the knowledge, the emotions that these books hold. It's about ensuring that these tangible pieces of history can continue to connect us to the past, inspire us in the present, and enrich our lives for generations to come.
Beautifully said. So next time you reach for a book, remember the journey it's taken, the stories it holds, and the legacy it represents. And remember, a little TLC goes a long way in keeping those stories alive. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of bookbinding. Until next time, happy reading.